2026, fin de la guerra.
2026, end of the war. The year 2026 could mark the end of the war in Ukraine. The growing Russian advances on the ground, Russia's devastating airstrikes against Ukraine's critical infrastructure, the unsustainable political situation of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and his close associates as a result of multiple corruption scandals, and now the relentless pressure coming from the United States against Zelensky himself. All of this is creating the conditions for Ukraine's collapse and Russia's final victory. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Berlin, Germany, we begin broadcast number 313 of Demolishing Myths Talks. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and support us through our PayPal account. From Madrid, Spain, we are joined by Mr. Juan Antonio Aguilar. Dear Juan Antonio, a very good start to the year. How are things over there?
Muy buen inicio de año. ¿Qué tal todo por ahí?
¿Qué tal? Feliz año 2020.
How's it going? Happy 2026. We're already in 2026. And well, the truth is, one can't be too optimistic, right? There were some good analysts who said that by the end of 2025, the war would be over. We've already seen that hasn't been the case. And I'm very much afraid this is going to continue. It's going to continue, as you rightly said, until there's a final defeat of the Kiev regime, given the many contradictions that exist within the regime, between the regime and its partners, between its partners in the United States, and so on. That's what we're going to talk about a bit today, right?
Efectivamente. Ahora bien, ¿qué tal si comenzamos?
Indeed. Now then, how about we start, Juan Antonio, with something also connected to this situation of desperation in Ukraine, but more specifically related to daily life, to the news from the last 48 hours following the Ukrainian attack on civilian facilities. A hotel. Indeed, we're going to present it right now. The attack on the facilities of a hotel in the Kherson region, precisely during New Year's Eve dinner. This criminal attack caused the death, if I remember correctly, according to the latest count, of at least 20 people and countless others. 28. Already 28? Well, I remembered 20, now the count is 28. And countless injured. These are the images of the Ukrainian drone attack. Here are more images as well. Terrifying. Right in the middle of the New Year's Eve dinner, truly criminal, this. The name of the hotel is Hotel Leo, in the Kherson region. Obviously in the part of Kherson controlled by Russia, naturally, right?
Nada cerca de índole militar, ni a la vista.
Nothing of a military nature, neither in sight nor even nearby. A premeditated attack on a hotel filled with tourists and visitors in the middle of a New Year's Eve dinner. Nothing more.
De la cena de fin de año. Sin más. Y Juan Antonio, por aquí las imágenes de...
And Juan Antonio, here are the images of the attack on the residence of Russian President Vladimir Putin in the Novgorod region. Indeed, right after the meeting between Zelensky and Trump in the United States, just hours later, clearly as a response to that meeting. Here are the images released by Russia of the drones, around 90 in total, half of them intercepted on their way to the Novgorod region, and the other half already near Putin's residence. The Ukrainians rejected this. They reject it. And the US government flirted with the idea that in fact the drones were targeting a site near Putin's residence, thousands, or at least more than 1,000 kilometers away from the front, if I remember correctly. But, according to some members of the US government, these drones were actually aimed at another target, not Putin's residence. That's why, just today, the Russians presented to US spy diplomatic authorities in Russia what they claim is evidence collected from these drones, material related to the hardware and navigation system, in which, according to the Russians, the coordinates of Putin's residence clearly appear as the target of these attacks. We can present that immediately afterward as well. And after that, we'll start with the analysis. Well, this about the drones over here. Just a second of patience. This is the symbolic act of handing over this material today to one of the US military and diplomatic representatives in Russia. The handover of what appears to be the navigation system from one of these drones that was shot down on its way to the residence. Juan Antonio, your opinion on all these developments. There are formal aspects, and then we'll analyze the facts themselves, and afterward, we'll see what the explanation for all this is.
We'll start with the massacre caused by Ukrainian drones on New Year's Eve during the New Year's dinner at a hotel in Kherson. I had told you there were 20 dead. Now there's some news saying 29. But, as one can imagine, many of the wounded are in serious condition, and the death toll may rise. It's a real massacre that shows the nature of the Kiev regime, because the attack was carried out in sync with the midnight chimes. There were 3 drones. One was launched a few minutes before midnight near the hotel cafe. It only caused minor damage. But another one carrying 20 kilos of TNT was launched at the hotel and caused the main destruction, also starting a fire since the drone carried an incendiary mixture.
Porque llevaba una mezcla incendiaria el dron. O sea, la intención era a quemar vivo a la gente. Y así ocurrió.
In other words, the intention was to burn people alive. And that's what happened. Many of those who died were burned alive. There was a third drone to attack the people fleeing the hotel when the explosion occurred. All right, this is the situation. That is to say, now that someone here is trying to justify it, some son of a bitch is trying to justify it, we must point out, fundamentally, that this event has been partly covered up because a tragedy occurred, not a similar one. This one really was an accident in Switzerland, where dozens of people also died in a nightclub fire on New Year's Eve. But the massacre committed by the Ukrainians in Kherson has been completely downplayed, if not erased, by the whole filth of the Western media.
De toda la cochambre de los medios de comunicación occidentales. Y esto debe hacernos reflexionar, y luego haremos una reflexión al respecto, ¿no?
And this should make us reflect, and we'll reflect on it later, on the nature of these media outlets and these journalists. But I put that in quotes, because any generalization is unfair. I know there are also people in the press who try to do things right. But this is how it is. This is how it is. The origin of the weaponry in the key components of these drones launched against Kherson turns out to be German-made and assembled in a factory near Munich. This, too, so that when it comes time to identify those responsible, we don't end up simply labeling that Ukrainian soldier as a criminal, the one who was told, you have to launch some drones, and he went, entered the coordinates, and launched them. The chain of criminals reaches Berlin. The chain of criminals reaches London. The chain of criminals reaches Paris and Washington. And then we'll see why all this. Now, some Russian officials have described it as a terrorist act or terrorist attack. In reality, it's a war crime, a crime against humanity, and moreover, it was carried out with deliberate brutality and cynicism, doing it now at the height of the New Year's scene, which reveals the absolutely psychopathic, serial criminal nature of all these people. There's no other way to describe it.
Y no hay otra forma de describirlo. La intencionalidad, bueno, posiblemente.
The intentionality, well, possibly, as we'll now see in the case of the attack on President Putin's residence, where he wasn't present, by the way, that should be made clear. Well, what they're aiming for is diplomatic sabotage. And we had already anticipated this in previous programs. One of the possibilities these people will pursue to keep the conflict going, to make sure the war continues, will be to carry out increasingly savage provocations. The idea is to see if the Russians react angrily, making negotiation impossible. There's also the issue of revenge, because the past few weeks have been one defeat after another on the front, right? And in the end, the attack on Putin's residence was a failure.
Entonces, bueno, pues, y además hay una cuestión de odio. ¿Por qué a Kherson?
And besides, there's an issue of hatred. Why against Kherson? Against the people of Kherson? Because they're people who have chosen to live in Russia. They're individuals from a Ukrainian region who have chosen to live and speak Russian. There's a deliberate intent of hatred and revenge against these people, which also shows us the true nature of the vermin in Kiev and their sponsors in the West. On the other hand, it already seems clear that Zelensky has no other choice. He's willing to commit any crime, including the murder of women and children, because several children have been killed, in order to stay in power and fulfill the mandate of who? His European masters. And finally, well, this is yet another sign of the terminal agony of the Kiev regime, when it has to resort to this kind of action, conveniently covered up by the criminal Western press.
Bien ocultadas por la prensa criminal occidental, ¿no? Es decir, pero bueno, es decir, ya nos tienen acostumbrados, ¿no?
Well, anyway, we're already used to it. Responsibilities? Of course, yes, indeed. Kiev's, because in the end, someone has to order this kind of action. But also those of the entire West and NATO, since they're the ones providing the weapons, the drones, the ones determining the targets. They're the ones offering intelligence or satellite support so these devices can be guided. And there's even speculation, as always, about the possible involvement of European intelligence services, especially the British, who already have experience in this kind of crime. They're experts. Well, a pattern of behavior. It's not an isolated incident.
Bueno, patrón de conducta no es un hecho aislado. Esto es una parte constante de las.
This is a constant part of Ukrainian operations, which is to attack civilians. That is, in Belgorod, in Kursk, in Bryansk, in Rostov-on-Don. They have also done so continuously since 2014 in Donetsk and the towns near Donetsk. The strategy followed, is the so-called double tap tactic, very typical of NATO. It consists of attacking the target and, once it has been hit, launching another attack to strike the rescue teams. That is, firefighters, paramedics, doctors who might respond. We saw this in the aggression against Yugoslavia, we saw it in Iraq and Libya, and we have seen it in Gaza.
Lo vimos en Irak y en Libia, y lo hemos visto en Gaza. Es decir, es de manual de la OTAN.
That is to say, it's straight out of NATO's playbook. A criminal organization, essentially a criminal organization. And anyone who collaborates with NATO, even professionally, and this is directed at many active duty uniformed soldiers, is complicit in these crimes, which weigh on their conscience. I would refuse to take part in such an action. I'd rather leave the military, because it means being complicit in vile war crimes, absolutely vile. Many of those decorated officers, with their sashes and sabers, were probably eating grapes at their New Year's Eve dinner at home, while the organization they belong to and collaborate with was massacring innocent civilians in Kherson.
Or
to the ammunition manufacturer who assembled those drones. He too would be raising his glass of champagne, spending the profits from the sale of death. Well, this is what it is. a premeditated and cynical demonstration of the terrorist nature of the Ukrainian government and the governments that support it. A crime made possible and encouraged by the backing of the military and the intelligent people of Western countries, without which it would have been impossible. It is an act that, moreover, far from weakening Russia, strengthens its determination and justifies its military objectives, thus working against the resolution of the conflict, which is precisely the goal, to keep the conflict unresolved and the war ongoing.
Antonio, very briefly, I wanted to show the location on the map as an effective explanation for the complete lack of connection to any military target. Here's the line of contact, the Kherson one, across this whole area that's been stable for quite some time.
The one in Kherson from here is the Dnieper River.
Exactly. We're not talking about, and far from there, on the shores of the Black Sea, on this very small peninsula here, surrounded by the Black Sea, an obviously summery region, a resort with beaches along the Black Sea coast. And there, a hotel. Not this one exactly, but around. It just appeared, well, on the other map, a little closer to the, if I remember correctly, here. Around here, one of these, if I remember correctly.
This one here from the shore.
Indeed, there's been an attack on a hotel in a seaside town, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest front line. A front that, by the way, is inactive and stabilized on both sides of the Dnipro River. And here, Juan Antonio, as we go through the Western press, nothing. Total radio silence. A few hours ago, the only exception was this one here, with this infamous BBC headline. Instead of attack on civilians, it read, Russia accuses Ukraine of killing 27 people in a New Year's attack in the occupied Kherson region. Now it's 29, according to the latest count, as Juan Antonio reports. But no, it's not Ukraine carries out a criminal attack against civilians. It's Russia accuses Ukraine of killing people in an attack in the occupied Kherson region.
It was the Martians, and then Russia took the opportunity to accuse Ukraine. Of course, that's how it is.
Shameful.
As everyone can understand, right? Anyway, let's also look at the issue of the attack on Putin's residence. It's already been discussed on other shows, although you hadn't done so. That is, the attack, the 91 drones that were shot down. The attack itself was a failure, but that's not the point. It's about the intent, because as you rightly said earlier, it happened right after the talks between Trump and Zelensky ended. Zelensky was still in Washington, meeting with Trump, and then this attack took place. What's the intention? Obviously, to once again sabotage any possibility of negotiation to end the conflict. It's crystal clear, and the White House knows this.
Es evidentísimo. Y esto lo saben en la Casa Blanca. ¿Qué pasó? Bueno, pues la CIA.
What happened? Well, the CIA, it's so serious, and on top of that, they fear the reaction of a Trump who might get angry, because obviously this attack wasn't only against Putin, it was also against Trump, who is the one most interested in reaching a final resolution to the conflict. Because ultimately Russia may be interested, but it holds the strategic initiative, it can endure and keep gaining ground, and continue destroying Ukrainian infrastructure and the army. So the one most interested, as we've mentioned before, is Trump. Electoral promise, midterm elections, the top priority of achieving peace, and so on. That is, the need for trade agreements with Russia. It's Trump who's most interested. So this goes against Trump's own political intentions. Let's see. The CIA puts together a report. The report says, according to non-Russian publications, specifically the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, meaning the hardcore of the Western media establishment, that Ukraine did not actually attack Putin's residence. Ukraine did carry out a drone strike in that region, which it admits. Second, the target was a military facility that had already been attacked before. Third, that target was not near Putin's residence. And fourth, there was no intention to personally attack Putin.
Y cuatro, que no había intención de atacar personalmente a Putin. Imagino que es que la CIA llamó por teléfono, oye, no toques.
I imagine the CIA made a phone call. Hey, no, we're the ones who want to attack Putin. Come on, who could think that? I mean, what nonsense. Well, that's the CIA's official version, which matches Kiev's official version. Fine. But of course, we need to analyze that information. And then there's a fundamental inconsistency, which Larry Johnson points out very well in an analysis he did. How can the CIA know with absolute certainty that the target was a distant military facility if, according to the CIA's own version, all 91 drones were shot down before reaching any target?
Los 91 drones fueron derribados antes de alcanzar cualquier objetivo. ¿Cómo sabe la CIA? Si los drones han sido derribados antes de alcanzar.
How does the CIA know? If the drones were shot down before reaching their targets, which they were, how does the CIA know that the target was going to be a specific military facility? What, by divine revelation? No? To have that knowledge, that certainty, the CIA must have had prior information about the attack plans. Otherwise, it's impossible. Anyone can understand that. The only way to know the destination of the downed drones is to have access to their transmission data before launch or to control them directly at launch. Otherwise, you can't have that data. The CIA is incriminating itself as being behind the attack. That's the conclusion.
Este es el resultado. Pero además hay una admisión tácita.
But there's also a tacit admission. By confirming that there was a Ukrainian attack in the region, even if they claim it had a different target, the CIA is implicitly validating the core of what Russia is alleging. That is, that Ukraine carried out an attack, a massive drone operation on Russian territory, near, or well, at the residence of the head of state. So the fact itself isn't denied, only its purpose. The CIA denies the purpose, but not the fact. And finally, there's physical evidence. The Russian Ministry of Defense handed over to the office of the U.S. military attaché in Moscow the controller, the remains of one of the 91 drones that were shot down. The Russians have the remains.
These are the images here.
Yes, I've got it written down here. The H743 Wing V3 model. So technically, what does that tell us? That it's a high-end device with complex algorithms that allows, first, the recovery of GPS coordinates and the exact flight paths. Second, the scheduled time and impact for the flight. Third, the orientation data, that is, heading, pitch, and roll at every moment of the flight. And that would make it possible to digitally reconstruct the entire drone mission and clearly demonstrate its programmed destination point. That's why the Russians are interested in saying, look, you're not going to fool us. Here's the proof. I've got 90 more pieces of evidence. That's what's being said. In other words, Russia not only makes an accusation, but also presents verifiable physical evidence, exposing that the CIA is lying. That he lies, and that this is nothing more than an example of a pattern that has existed since the beginning of the conflict, a pattern of behavior by the Kiev regime and its sponsors. We could start with the assassination of Daria Dugina, continue with the attacks on the Kerch Bridge in Crimea, the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines, the killing of pro-Russian personnel and journalists, the attacks on Russian checkpoints or energy infrastructure or on civilians, as in Belgorod, the border incursions such as the one in Kursk, or the terrorist attacks against General Igor Kirillov, Yaroslav Moskalik, and most recently, just a few days ago, against General Fanil Salvarov. In other words, this is nothing new. This is whose pattern of behavior? NATO's. The pattern of behavior of NATO. The timing of the attack is key. Why? Because it doesn't happen at just any moment. It happens precisely when Trump is negotiating with Zelensky in Washington. In other words, the current intention is a noble objective. First, an attack against Putin, or at least damaging a symbol of Russian power, whether it's a military base or the head of state's bunker, whatever it may be. And a strategic diplomatic objective, to sabotage any peace process by showing that Kiev and its accomplices are not negotiating in good faith, but rather using truces to rearm or attack. Well, this is what it shows us, and what the New York Times report reveals. The political hypocrisy that exists in the United States.
Es la hipocresía política que existe en Estados Unidos. Por un lado, la CIA intensifica los ataques a la infraestructura energética.
On one hand, the CIA is stepping up attacks on Russian energy infrastructure. The United States is authorizing Ukrainian attacks against the Russian merchant fleet. And all of this is happening alongside rhetoric about seeking peace, negotiation, and so on. So, well, we can already start to see the bigger picture. This doesn't bode well for 2026. That's the truth. It doesn't bode well. Why? Well, because as a result of these developments we're seeing, Russia naturally loses all confidence and cannot believe in any Western guarantees for a serious negotiation. And this attack dispels any doubt. And what happened at Gerson's hotel? Same thing. The Russian military response? Well, you can imagine it. It's going to come. It's going to come. And it's going to come with full justification, of course. No one should be shocked when it happens. Russian intelligence will try to locate where NATO and intelligence advisors are on Ukrainian soil, and they'll go after them. This will likely harden Russia's stance in the negotiations. And Trump will have to understand this, because things don't just happen for no reason. Trump should realize that he's also one of those attacked these days. Whether he understands it is another matter. We already know what he's like. The only action left for Russia is decisive military action, to push toward defeat until achieving the surrender of the Kiev regime. That's why at this point, I believe a point of no return has been crossed, and it's going to be very difficult for peace negotiations to move forward at a pace that would allow the war to end soon. And so at this stage, we can already ask, what do we have? What is the scenario we're in? And what can we envision for 2026?
Juan Antonio, antes de tu análisis quería una vez más.
Juan Antonio, before your analysis, I wanted once again to show the map as proof of the provocative nature of this attack in Ukraine. Here is the disputed area. Take note of the location of Putin's residence, right around here, near Lake Valdai, in the Novgorod Oblast. That's precisely where Putin's residence is. The intercepted drones, some of them from the 90s, were intercepted roughly in this area. Notice the distance from Ukraine. I can't even fit it on the map. From the closest point, it's about 600 kilometers more or less, the minimum distance from the Russian border. This obviously was carried out from even farther away. Yes, clearly. There is absolutely no military logic in any of this, obviously.
Like what happened at the hotel in Kherson, what military purpose does that serve? Just to cause a massacre, that's all. A massacre of women, children, and civilians.
That's all. This is the trajectory of the drones, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense. About half were intercepted roughly halfway, or in the first third, in the Bryansk Oblast, 49 and 41 in Novgorod. All right, so dear Juan Antonio, what situation are we in regarding the possibility of peace in 2026?
Well, based on what's been said, as I mentioned, I'll give my impression, and I hope I'm wrong. But my impression is that this is heading in a very bad direction. This is going to slow down the peace talks. Not only because there are shadowy actors who want to prevent the negotiations from moving forward, but also because logically, what happens with these things is that the Russian government hardens its stance, which causes a setback and brings back discussions about issues that may have already been addressed, but in light of recent events, lose their relevance. I'm not going to say we're back to square one, but it's clear that the situation isn't good. And here, of course, one has to look at who the actors are.
Y aquí, claro, uno tiene que ver quiénes son los actores, ¿no? Es decir, qué actores, y ahora ya nos elevamos un poco al plan geopolítico.
That is, which actors? And now we're moving up a bit to the geopolitical level, speaking globally. There's an actor here that is the deep state. The deep state, so we can all understand and everyone intuitively knows what we're talking about, consists of all those high-ranking officials involved in foreign policy, the armed forces, intelligence services, and economic powers, who make decisions outside of the political decision-makers, outside of those who are supposed to make them, namely the leaders elected in democratic elections and so on. In other words, the influence of this deep state is significant.
Es decir, la influencia de este Estado profundo es significativa. Y este Estado profundo tiene influencia, por supuesto, en la Unión Europea.
And this deep state has influence, of course, in the European Union, in NATO, in the United Kingdom, and also within the U.S. administration. For example, the CIA, which Trump has still not been able to purge, even though he should have sent them all to Guantanamo. What's happening? Well, this deep state also has a key partner that plays a role in all of its own decision-making, the Zionist state. That is, the Jewish lobbies, the Zionists, and the State of Israel itself. We've already mentioned two actors, third actor, Trump himself.
Tercer actor, Trump, el propio Trump. Y el cuarto actor, que es el actor ejecutivo.
And the fourth actor, the executing actor, so to speak, is the Kiev regime. So what do we see? Well, that the deep state constantly manipulates Trump, because of course Trump, after all, who informs him? How does Trump get his information? He gets it because someone informs him. Who informs him? The CIA, that is the ones carrying out the crimes. Marco Rubio, who's one of the neocons, part of the deep state, acting under its orders. Scott Wesson, who's also another dependent of the deep state, who informs Trump, beyond whatever personal intentions Trump might have. Instead of Trump, you could put any other name. It doesn't matter. Biden, Clinton, Obama.
Clinton. Obama. ¿Quién informa al presidente de los Estados Unidos?
Who informs the president of the United States? Who puts reality on the table for him? These guys. And if you don't clean that up, you're in danger. Absolutely in danger. And if you do clean it up, you might end up with an attack. That has to be understood too. So we have a deep state that, on one hand, directs Kiev, which is nothing more than a puppet, a clique of corrupt thieves controlled from abroad, and manipulates Trump. A Trump who, on the other hand, seeks changes in Kiev that could speed up the peace process. Hence all the activity from the Ukrainian anti-corruption agency, as we've seen in recent days. But he also has his own policy lines, as laid out in the national security strategy. And now we'll look at that part. Anyway, these actors have their moves.
Pero, bueno, estos actores tienen sus acciones. Y, ¿cuál es la acción?
And what are the actions carried out by the boss sent by the deep state? Terrorism, pure terrorism. That's why we see the attack on the hotel in Garzon, the attack on Putin's residence, and we'll keep seeing bloody provocations from this bunch. Because they need to make sure negotiations don't move forward, that the war continues, and somehow even save Zelensky and his clique, or at least the clique, because the whole setup of massive corruption must be maintained, the one that precisely reaches that deep state, both in the European Union and in the United Kingdom and the United States. For that, of course, they also have an invaluable weapon, an entire propaganda apparatus of media outlets, those who call themselves journalists, who are true accomplices in the crimes against humanity committed by these people. No one should be deceived about this. The clear proof is the silence in the face of a massacre like the one that took place on New Year's Eve. Do you remember Busha, that setup they made, claiming that the Russians, when they withdrew, had killed some civilians? The way they went on about that. Later it was proven to be a fabrication, but it doesn't matter. Let's imagine that some crazy Russian had done it, right? The way they went on about that. But this, they hide. Just as they seem unwilling to remember nearly 50 people burned alive in the House of Trade Unions in Odessa on May 2nd, 2014, when there still hasn't been a trial or anyone charged. This is the criminal nature of the Kiev regime and of those who support it.
Del régimen de Kiev y de los que apoyan al régimen de Kiev. De los que apoyan al régimen de Kiev.
Those who support the Kiev regime. This includes the Western governments: Spanish, Italian, French, Belgian, Dutch, Finnish, British, German, Danish. As for the Baltics, I won't even mention them. We don't want the discussion to drift into the realm of psychiatry. That's the issue. And well, those actors have a plan. The plan of terrorism to prevent progress toward a peace negotiation in Ukraine. Just as there's another plan, for example, another actor we mentioned earlier, Israel. Israel's role to convince Trump that Iran must be targeted while at the same time destabilizing the Middle East. For instance, the latest move, recognizing a separatist region in Somalia, Somaliland, where it could set up a base and perhaps deport the 2 million Palestinians from Gaza. And for that, he has to convince Trump. Once again, Trump is being manipulated. So Trump, within that national security strategy, decides that the plan is to destabilize Venezuela and also to destabilize Iran. And there we see the protests happening in Iran, while new attacks on Iran are being threatened. This is the kind of action being prepared. In other words, the pattern is very similar. Wherever there is a conflict hotspot, we see a convergence of factors determined by what we call the deep state, which follows the directives of the elites, mainly economic and financial, to maintain the status quo as the ruling class. And to do that, a series of actors are then manipulated. The Kiev regime, a Trump who is nothing more than a ridiculous mafioso puppet who doesn't understand anything because he neither knows nor feels nor suffers. And there are already doubts about his health, even his mental health. And so, well, these actors explain all these kinds of actions, right? They laid out their plans, and from those plans comes a series of actions. That's what we're seeing now on a global scale, in the various conflict hotspots that exist. Ultimately, there are aspects that our viewers need to understand clearly, and that our viewers, moreover, should somehow share with others. There is a really existing West, the one we see. I know there's a historical West, which is something else entirely and has nothing to do with this one. It's the West of Tolstoy, of Beethoven, of Goethe, and of Leonardo da Vinci. Yes, that's the West. But the really existing West is the one we're suffering under. And the highest stage of the West is crime. I mean, get that into your head. The highest stage of the West is crime. And we see it constantly. Trump is a ridiculous mob-like puppet, as I've said. That's how he is. But I do think we need to unmask Trumpism. That is, all those who in some way support or sympathize with Trump for a series of ideological reasons, ignoring everything else, ignoring that he's a puppet serving the deep state and therefore the interests of globalists and the ruling classes. Maybe unconsciously, Trump is thinking about his Nobel Peace Prize and things like that, and doesn't realize he's not a statesman, doesn't realize it. And if he looks at his balance sheet and things are going well, his personal finances, then maybe he realizes it even less and cares even less. If what he wants is to go play golf at Mar-a-Lago and get the Nobel Peace Prize, the Eurovision contest, and an Oscar in California, in Los Angeles.
According to a Bloomberg report from yesterday, Trump's personal wealth has increased by 70% over the past year and a half. It now amounts to $6 billion, whereas before it was roughly half that.
Now then, there's something more dangerous than Trump, and that's Trumpism. It's all those people who think that since Trump opposes, for example, woke ideology or the Californian left, then he must be one of us. No, let's be clear. Woke ideology, the ideology of the Californian left, and all that are nothing more than ideological superstructures. In a capitalist class society, the superstructure can be changed to preserve what really matters, the interests of the economic infrastructure of the ruling class. Exactly. And what Trump does is change the ideological superstructure while keeping the essence of the system intact.
Lo que viene es a cambiar la superestructura ideológica, manteniendo la esencia del sistema, manteniendo todo lo demás, manteniendo las clases dominantes,
Keeping everything else the same, keeping the ruling classes that once created or used that ideological superstructure, and now they replace it with another one. That's Trumpism. And all these fools who in various media outlets give their opinions, experts saying that Trump is an anti-globalist, but no, you're not. If the infrastructure isn't touched, the only thing that's changing is the superstructure. And the superstructure can be changed without altering the essence of the system. And this is a reality that also needs to be dismantled, so that no one thinks Trump is the savior of the world right now. Could Trump be interested in peace in Ukraine? Certainly.
¿A Trump le puede interesar la paz en Ucrania? Seguro. Lo hemos dicho antes. Hay factores importantes, aparte de los personales de él.
We've said it before. There are important factors, aside from his personal ones, that would make it in the interest of a sector of the American elite to bring the war to an end. But that's only one sector, and precisely it may not be the dominant sector of the deep state, which controls the media, the intelligence services, and much of the financial system. Those people probably aren't interested, and they're going to sabotage Trump. And the worst part is that this idiot won't even realize it. He'll think he's saving the world while fattening his bank account. He really is a fool. An absolute fool. And we have to understand that this West has turned into countries that sponsor terrorism and genocide.
Que patrocinan el terrorismo y el genocidio. No voy a recordar todos los episodios que hemos vivido en 2025.
I'm not going to recall the episodes of terrorism and genocide we experienced in 2025. Does the name Gaza ring a bell? Well, that's it. Enough. One example to illustrate it all. Western countries sponsor terrorism and genocide. And then comes the time not only to point the finger solely and exclusively at the guilty ones, we must also point to those responsible. And here, the ones responsible are all our dear compatriots, from whatever country they may be, in Europe and NATO, who are complicit in everything that happens. Complicit because they pay attention only to the media, which have been lying to them for years, which continue to lie to them, and which they still believe, even though their lies have already been exposed.
Cuando han quedado en evidencia ya sus mentiras. Si te han engañado una vez, la culpa es del que...
If you've been deceived once, the blame lies with the one who deceived you. But if you're deceived a second time, the blame is yours for allowing yourself to be deceived. And you've been deceived since 2008. They've been deceiving you constantly. When they bailed out the banks with your money, while there was no bailout for the people being evicted from their homes or losing their jobs, they've been deceiving you ever since. And you still believe them. We still believe them. We keep watching those TV channels, reading those newspapers, listening to those radio stations, and we keep believing them. So at that point, it's no longer just their fault. That blame also falls on the rest of us. And of course, when we see heinous crimes like the one at Gerson's Hotel, maybe many people should look in the mirror and think about what they voted for back then. Because they voted for those who uphold the framework, the structure of organized crime that the West represents at this moment. Consequently, what can we expect in 2026? Well, given that there is a deep state that manipulates, that controls certain actors and manipulates others, so that, according to certain plans, destabilization takes place, whether in the Middle East, Iran, the Caribbean, Eastern Europe, the Asia-Pacific region, or the Sea of Japan, the only thing we can expect is for conflicts to keep flowing, for existing ones not to be resolved, and for even more to emerge. That's the only thing we can expect. And as I said before, I hope I'm wrong. But this looks bad.
Ojalá me equivoque. Pero esto pinta mal. Esto pinta mal.
This looks bad. In that context, Juan Antonio, how will Russia respond? Here are Putin's words from 4 days ago, or 3 days ago, in a meeting with the Minister of Defense and the High Command of the Russian Armed Forces. These are some of the things he said, just a little bit. It was in English with subtitles, but I'm doing the translation. He began with this: "The enemy is trying to disrupt the development of the situation in Kupiansk, and that must be definitively stopped," he said, looking with a cold expression at the officer in charge of Kupiansk, who in another live broadcast meeting had presented Kupiansk as definitively taken. And Putin asked him again, "Completely taken?" And he replied, very proudly, "Yes, yes, yes."
Completamente tomada, y él respondió muy orgulloso, sí, sí, sí. Bueno, una parte fue reconquistada por Ucrania, ya comenzó.
Well, part of it was reconquered by Ukraine. The reconquest of the Russian reconquest has already begun. But Putin's expression here put him in his place. He reprimanded him, very diplomatically. Then the most interesting part of this is about to appear. Well, I know he's taking steps toward that. And now we all understand that the liberation of Seversk and the operations in Konstantinivka allow us to create the conditions for further economic advances. To fully take the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk axis, Konstantinivka in relation to Bakhmut, remember, is the Russian name, to take the entire defensive line there, and together with the Western Command and the Central Command, completely liberate the Donbass region.
Por completo la región del Donbass. Y ahora Teplinsky, el comandante.
And now this Teplinsky, the commander, if I'm not mistaken, of the Southern Command, the most effective one, the one with the greatest advances, the one from the police, presents a report. The offensive group continues operations in Zaporizhzhia. The most advanced units are now barely 15 kilometers from the outskirts of Zaporizhzhia. End of report. Putin responds, "How many? 15 kilometers?" Yes, indeed, 15 kilometers from the outskirts. And now pay attention to this. We must then continue the advances together with the Eastern Group and completely liberate Zaporizhzhia. All of this, Juan Antonio, gives the impression of a very clear decision by Putin that beyond any back and forth with Trump, with Zelensky, with NATO, and all the rest, Russia has decided that it will achieve its objectives through military means. Is that so? Or do they still seem delusional in Russia, hoping for negotiations or some middle ground solution? Juan Antonio.
No, yo creo, vamos a ver, es decir, yo creo que
No, I think that, let's say, with Trump's insistence, the Kremlin has been able to observe and analyze that there really was a possibility of achieving most of their objectives without needing to continue the military campaign. But look, no general staff would expect all that to stop, to come to a halt because of diplomacy, and then just stop acting. No. The general staff has a campaign plan, and that campaign plan will continue until the political leadership, the commander-in-chief, says, "All right, stop there." As long as that order doesn't come, the campaign plan will go on. And right now, aside from the advances in the north, with the idea of creating a containment strip in the Chernihiv regions, where, by the way, they're evacuating Ukrainian populations, already moving people out of many towns near the border, in Sumy and Kharkiv, it's clear what the next center of gravity around which the campaign will revolve is going to be. It's the advance from the north through Sever and from the south through Kostiantynivka toward the agglomeration. It's the Matos plain. It's over. The entire lobe falls there already. It's over. And from that point on, what they have are the vast steppes that stretch all the way to the Dnipro. The Dnipro. And in the south, the southern offensive is very important. First, because it's become clear that the Ukrainian army no longer has the capacity to stop it. It's not just that Velika Novosilka has fallen, but also that the command center has fallen as well. But with the computers still on. Someone might think, well, then just turn them off. Having the computers on means there's no need to enter passwords to access them. They were already open. And that's critical information, the kind the Russians were able to obtain there. So, we're about 15 kilometers from the capital, Sumy, and about 13 or 15 kilometers from the capital of Zaporizhia. I'm referring to oblast capitals. The main concentration is along the route in Kramatorsk, in the largest cities of the Donbass, after Donetsk and Horlivka. And the problem, moreover, is that Zaporizhia allows crossing the Dnipro and entering from the north toward Mykolaiv. And Mykolaiv is the gateway to Odessa. I'm very much afraid that the campaign plan for spring may precisely be to complete the full liberation of the Donbass and reach the Dnipro from the south. That is, to take control of Zaporizhia in order to enable the advance toward Mykolaiv and Feodosia.
El salto hacia Nicolai y Feodosia.
Exactly, because they already warned about it with the attacks on oil tankers and civilian ships. I mean, it's not like they haven't been announcing it. It's not like it isn't clear, in some way, what the next moves in Russia's military campaign plan might be. And what's being done to counter that? What? In the end, how long have we been hearing, Ezekiel, the coalition of the willing, unwilling, and opposed, saying they're going to send 30,000, 50,000, 200 million troops to Ukraine? Where do we stand? Where do we stand? It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. All they have left is terrorism and lies. Lies in the media, in propaganda, and terrorism. That is, killing people, which is the only thing NATO is really good at. Killing people. Especially if they're civilians, whether Libyan, Yugoslav, Afghan, or Iraqi. That's what they're experts at. Killing. Now, as for a military campaign plan to say, we're going to do a good professional job, let's not fool ourselves. All the military plans carried out by the Ukrainian General Staff over the past 3 years have been drawn up by NATO commanders, from the base in Poland and from the base, I can't recall the name, in Germany, like the United States. I think it has another name. It seems to me that the German base where NATO's high command meets has another name, the one that determines the Ukrainian campaign plan. Well, it's a failure, an embarrassing fiasco. 30 countries, plus a few others that joined in, and here we are with this situation. So, what do they come up with? Let's attack Putin's residence. That is, Russia has a number of state residences for the president because he shouldn't always be located in the same place. Let's not be ridiculous. Well, he wasn't there that night, but let's attack Putin's presidency. Today, on New Year's Eve, we're going to make a big show of it.
Vamos a hacer la gran publicidad, ¿no? Vamos a masacrar a la pobre gente que está en un hotel celebrando la...
We're going to massacre the poor people who are in a hotel celebrating New Year's. And this is what NATO knows how to do. And this is what all that press we put up with day after day praises. Those infamous news broadcasts, those ridiculous front pages run by a bunch of failed, underpaid guys. In other words, they have no decency, no ethics, nothing. They have no human values whatsoever. They're real human trash, absolute trash. They don't have the dignity to say, I'm leaving, I won't keep collaborating in this. Well, there they all are, spreading fake news. Let's see if we can identify a Kremlin influence agent. Come on, I'm sure they get paid like a quick transfer from the Kremlin. That's the kind of people they are.
Juan Antonio, una pregunta...
Juan Antonio, a military question. In fact, I discussed it a few days ago with Fernando Moragon about Russia's priorities for next year regarding 2 scenarios. Apparently, Putin has already decided, and actually made it clear in this meeting, that they are going to achieve their objectives militarily, regardless of the madness of the West. Now then, 2 major possible scenarios seem to be emerging. Reality will likely present a mix, a combination of both. But based on Russia's recent advances, could the Russians decide to place the emphasis on an attack along the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk axis? Here, I'm a bit lost on the map now. This Sloviansk-Kramatorsk defensive axis, including Kostiantynivka, is a heavily fortified region, with a total population of around 500,000, fortified since 2014, with very significant importance.
Con un significado muy importante. Recordemos el inicio de
Let's remember the beginning of the pro-Russian uprisings in Sloviansk, the back and forth regarding that city, and so on. That's one of the possible priority objectives. But on the other hand, there are also increasingly rapid advances from the south and from the west, moving right to left towards Zaporizhzhia. The latest, the capture of Ulivka and Polohy, the advances here, 15 kilometers away in this Pology, and so on. This is another possibility, prioritizing Zaporizhzhia. If you were Putin and had both plans on your desk, one or the other, the capture of Zaporizhzhia or that of Sloviansk-Kramatorsk, considering the advantages and disadvantages, the ease and difficulty of each, which in your opinion would be the smartest objective?
¿Cuál, en tu opinión, el objetivo más inteligente?
Es decir, el frente está dividido por parte rusa en 4 grupos.
That is to say, the front is divided, on the Russian side, into 4 army groups. Each one has its mission. The campaign plan is carried out, and each fulfills its role. I believe that, from a strategic point of view, the focus will be on the Donbass issue. Why? Because if the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration falls, you won't be able to stop the Russian advance toward Dnipro, since all that area is steppe. In other words, there's no longer, really, with artificial intelligence they've shown us the fortifications and the lines that were being built. But in modern warfare, that's going to have a very, very limited effect. I think the attrition that could occur and the drop in morale over the Donbass issue will be decisive. Because look, in the end it would be said, they're simply thinking about the peace settlement. One of Russia's demands was the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the rest of the Donbass, that is, from that area. If that area is liberated by the Russian army, what will be left then? I mean, people are already talking then about another scenario. It's no longer the same. And that's why Russia has already said that what has happened in recent days will change the terms of the negotiation. Why? Because they already expect it to take a month, 2 months, 3 months. But that concentration will fall. It will fall judging by the pace of the Russian army's advance, right? That won't stop the Southern Army Group from doing what it has to do, which is to advance towards Zaporizhzhia, cross the Dnipro, and carry out an encircling maneuver toward Mykolaiv and Odessa, which would be critical. In fact, the Ukrainian command would practically have no choice but to move all possible forces to try to stop that maneuver. But that would leave the northern and central areas practically unprotected. Who then is going to defend Kharkiv and its region, or the advance toward Dnipro? The situation, well, one must always remember something that's often said whenever talking about general staff matters, right? That is, no plan survives contact with the enemy. After that, things can turn out very differently, depending on whatever madness drives someone to act or not act, right? I mean, well, right there, the Ukrainian army is burning through a very valuable reserve, trying to capture a few neighborhoods in Kupiansk. Does Kupiansk really have that much strategic value now to justify that? Or when they lose it for good, are they going to say, well, it wasn't that important anyway? So then, why are you burning through unit after unit after unit there? This already happened to you in Lyman, in Bakhmut, in Chasiv Yar. I mean, it's not the first time. You burn through units and units and units, only to later say that it didn't have such great strategic importance after all, right? Pokrov. Look, after all that's been said about Pokrov, and now that it's fallen into Russian hands, it seems Pokrov doesn't matter at all. Well, let's see how your advance goes there when the maneuver at Velika Novosilka takes place, and a big cauldron forms around the whole Sloviansk and Kramatorsk area. That's going to wipe out your army, what's left of it. You're going to lose it there, and if not, you'll have to retreat. And if you retreat, where do you retreat to? What fortified line have you prepared to stop 2 army groups coming at you from that direction? Where are you going to fall back to? The Dnipro? The other side of the Dnipro? And then you're leaving a third of Ukraine behind. giving it up. The situation, I don't know, it's very delicate.
Es que la situación, no sé, es muy delicada. Yo imagino que el alto mando ruso se irá adaptando.
I imagine that the Russian High Command will adapt according to the pace of operations. And now, for example, since the front in the south has been broken, obviously the Southern Army Group is advancing and will keep moving forward as fast as it can. And it's advancing quite rapidly compared to what progress has been like over the past 2 years. Considering the nature of drone warfare, it's moving at great speed. And that becomes clear with a very simple comparison, right? I mean, how long did it take to capture Bakhmut or Avdiivka or Chasiv Yar? 3 weeks. Even the command center has fallen, and they fled from there so quickly that they left the computers on. They didn't even take them with them.
Encendidos los ordenadores, ni siquiera se los llevaron. O sea, esto te indica ya que
This already shows you that the Russian sector is advancing at a certain speed, and the others can't make an orderly retreat to the next defensive line. Why? Because they don't have enough time. Why? Because the Russian advance is greater than what they anticipated. I'm talking about speed, right? The speed of the advance is greater than what they expect. If they calculate, as has often happened, that they could advance 500 meters, a kilometer, or a kilometer and a half in a day, now they're seeing that it's possible to advance 3, 5, or even 7 kilometers. So of course, there's hardly enough time to dismantle everything, move it to the next defensive line, and set it up there.
llevarte a la siguiente línea de defensa y montarlo allí. Es que la guerra, es decir, las operaciones.
The thing is, war, meaning military operations, is complicated, very complicated. Of course, people who see war through Hollywood, Saving Private Ryan, right? But military operations are extremely complex. You're moving units of thousands and thousands of troops that have to be transported in vehicles, protected by air defense and counter-battery fire. There are thousands upon thousands of personnel who need to eat every day, who need water, medicine, fuel, and ammunition. In other words, keeping all of that coordinated and effective is no simple task. Anyone who thinks this is just a matter of a few maps spread out on a table and that I'm moving divisions around like Hitler did at the last moment in the bunker, divisions that no longer even existed, well, it's going to look like that. This is very complicated. Very complicated. It's not surprising that at a certain point, a break in the front, for whatever reason it happens, a break in the front could lead to a phase in which the Russians exploit that success, advance faster than the European General Staff had planned, and find themselves in a delicate situation. And this could trigger even broader withdrawals, meaning that more territory would be left to the Russian advance. So, I think that, what's going to be the main focus? I think it'll be the Donbass, but because of the objectives and also because, symbolically, it would be, come on, think about it. We said we would liberate the Donbass, and we have liberated the Donbass. From a symbolic point of view, from a psychological point of view, that's very important. I think that's where the main effort will go. However, if the front collapses in Kharkiv or in Zaporizhzhia, and the army groups advance faster, then those could possibly become the main lines, without, of course, abandoning the Donbass issue. But they could become the main lines. We can't foresee that right now, nor can we predict whether the resilience within the Ukrainian army, which is rapidly weakening, will end up diminishing even faster, which would allow for more operations in different parts of the front. And maybe you manage to drive a wedge where you least expect it. Of course, if there were a major collapse of the front in Sumy and Russia decided to send reinforcements there from its reserves, who's to say they couldn't afford an offensive toward Kyiv? Why not from the north? Imagine the effect. People saying, the Russians are already 80 kilometers from Kyiv. That is to say, practically speaking, drones could already start reaching almost directly, in a short time, all the way to the Ukrainian capital. Even long-range artillery could now reach it. I believe, though that's just my perception, that because of its political, moral, psychological, and symbolic importance, the main focus will continue to be the Donbass until its final liberation. But indeed, we might find that new lines of advance start appearing elsewhere. And of course, the southern one is very clear, because the south is also highly strategic. As I said, reaching the Dnieper and being able to cross it near Zaporozhye would mean a possible flanking maneuver toward Nikolaev and from there to Odessa.
Yes, yes. And perhaps without the difficulties of capturing Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, with massive fortifications and also with the help of the river. The issue of the rivers there is largely decisive.
And without having to launch an offensive from Kherson to another area that's very swampy. Remember, they broke a dam and everything got flooded. In other words, there are many more difficulties there. Besides, the bridges are destroyed. An amphibious assault on Odessa from the sea would also be more difficult, at least initially. Another thing is that if you already have a column advancing, making an encirclement, then the division of the reserves you have to defend Odessa might make it easier to carry out an amphibious landing, for example, to the west of Odessa, and you start cutting off Ukrainian territory, in addition to making contact with Transnistria. It's just that there could be, I don't know, all sorts of operations they might be imagining. There will be plans for everything, I can assure you of that. There will be plans for everything. And plan A and plan B. And contingency plans.
Last question, Juan Antonio, with a bit of self-promotion, by the way, because today we're launching our presence on Patreon. Here, in fact, is the Patreon cover. Maybe we look better from the side. We're starting with an analysis, a commentary, a reaction to Glenn Dixon's interview with Sergei Karaganov. Unmissable. What we can't show on YouTube, we'll be presenting from now on Patreon. Patreon with exclusive content, lots of comments. Well, 93 new subscribers just today. Many comments from people a bit harsh, confused. Are you going to abandon YouTube? No, not at all. YouTube remains the center of our activity, and what we can't show here, for example, this analysis of a live interview dubbed into Spanish with Sergei Karaganov, we'll present on our Patreon channel. In this interview, precisely, and now that the self-promotion is done, Karaganov presented a rather interesting scenario regarding the future. According to him, Trump's arrival in government and the current situation will lead to a temporary resolution of the war in Ukraine, and later, before long, a direct war between Russia and Europe will begin. That would determine a total defeat for Europe. Karaganov calls for lowering the nuclear threshold and the eventual use of nuclear weapons. Ultimately, that European defeat would create the possibility of the emergence of a Eurasian security framework, if not a definitive one, at least a stable one. How plausible does such a scenario seem to you, Juan Antonio? The resolution of the war in Ukraine, but not of the underlying conflict, and a direct war between Russia and Europe, without the United States supporting Europe, and logically, Europe's defeat.
Yes, let's see. The point, what I think is being laid out there, is one of the General Staff's plans, one of the possible scenarios. The scenario is that Trump is not going to intervene in Europe because that would throw away all his efforts this year and so on, in talks with Russia, with the new national security strategy, etc. So he's not going to intervene. But of course, what can the European Union and NATO countries in Europe do? Launch a war against Russia. They would lose it, and they know it. That's the point in Karaganov's analysis I'm referring to. Will they dare? They might be crazy enough to try, But a conflict between European NATO and Russia would mean Russia's use of tactical nuclear weapons in Iskander format. And it's no small matter that Iskander missiles have already been deployed in Belarus. Therefore, all NATO bases would be within range of the 6 warheads on each missile, with between 10 and 50 kilotons, targeting control centers, command centers, military bases, air bases, ports, critical infrastructure, transport hubs, and so on.
Infraestructuras críticas, nudos de transporte, etc. Claro, es decir, de verdad, la Unión, los países de Europa.
Of course, I mean, are European countries really going to withstand a military clash of that magnitude? It's doubtful. It's doubtful. I mean, okay, let's imagine they do, and that would indeed lead to a situation of possible defeat. And then what about the consequences? Because, of course, what's the exit plan for a war like that? It can only be a negotiation, yet another negotiation. And in that negotiation, what will Russia's conditions be? That Ukraine abandons the Donbass? No, that's no longer going to be the case. I mean, if that chapter ends, that won't be it anymore. So what will the conditions be? Very well, NATO withdraws to the 1997 borders, and we establish a buffer zone, a security zone, both for Russia and for the rest of the European countries along the eastern borders. That's what Karaganov is essentially specifying. What's the weak point in all this?
¿Cuál es el punto débil del asunto? Porque yo no sé si es que Karaganov piensa que los europeos están...
I don't know whether Karaganov thinks Europeans are obviously crazy, or if he believes they think they can win a war like that they would actually jump into the conflict. It seems to me that such a possibility doesn't exist, and that European countries, right now, without Trump, without the United States, are incapable of doing anything. They're a real bunch of cowards. They're not going to do anything. They can provoke. They can try to create low-intensity conflict situations. The usual stuff. Seize a ship here, something happens there, intercept some drones, a border incident occurs somewhere. But from there to escalating into an open war, which they know would leave Russia no choice. Because, of course, there are 30 NATO countries, even if the United States and Canada weren't involved.
Son 30 países los de la OTAN, aunque Estados Unidos y Canadá no estuvieran, ¿vale? Siguen siendo 28 países de la OTAN.
There are still 28 NATO countries. They would have no choice but to put enough firepower into their military units to be able to deal with that. And how is that achieved? With hypersonic weapons, carrying tactical nuclear warheads. There's no other way. On the other hand, we're counting on Trump being able to close the Ukrainian chapter, that the deep state lets him, or that he's not convinced or not deceived, or any other circumstance. Right now, I also see it as complicated, because Trump's situation is very unfortunate, very unfortunate. He's a person who changes his mind every day depending on who he talks to, or whether his golf game went well, or if cryptocurrencies went up. In other words, the world is in hands that make you want to tremble. So I think that before the possible scenario Karaganov describes, which makes perfect sense, we would see other situations that are no less complicated. First, how the situation in Ukraine will end, and whether Ukraine will remain a viable state or not. Second, once the Ukraine chapter is closed, with a Russian army that's veteran, experienced, and over 2 million strong, what will NATO do? Will it start a general mobilization? Is everything going to be centered around that war? Will certain governments admit it? Will there be unanimity to move it forward? Won't problems arise in some countries? That is, before reaching that point, the European issue might blow up. It might happen before that and explode. It's a completely plausible scenario, but we'd have to see whether the signs are leading us in that direction or another. And we'll only be able to know that over the coming months, especially by seeing how the Ukrainian chapter ends.
Sorry.
Perdón, sobre Ucrania, por cierto, el propio
About Ukraine, by the way, Karaganov himself, in that unmissable interview, The link, by the way, to Patreon appears in the description of all our videos, all our talks, all our live streams, and anyone who wants to can also watch the 15-minute preview, the first 15 minutes. That also appears on our channel, in the video list, the first 15 minutes. According to Karaganov, Russia is going to capture practically all of Ukraine up to the Dnieper River, but it doesn't want the rest of Ukraine, and that remaining ultranationalist part of Ukraine will emerge as, or represent, the spearhead of that warlike Europe.
La punta de lanza de esa Europa belicista. Es el escenario planteado por él.
That's the scenario he laid out. And regarding the Oryzhnik missiles, yes, he presents them as an intermediate option, but for him, Russia should still begin with tactical scale attacks, right? And Karaganov also insists many times that the United States would not take part in a confrontation of this kind, and that Biden himself didn't even raise the possibility of nuclear strikes, even in the event of a Russian attack on Europe. And that's true, isn't it? Yes, yes.
Un escenario preocupante.
A worrying scenario is that, of course, let's see. Now let's put ourselves there, in the Oval Office. And then the Europeans, stubborn because it's what they want, decide to go to war against Russia. What should Washington do? Follow the Europeans just because they want to, or make its own calculations. And then imagine someone says, no, let's follow them. And when the first nuclear strike happens, what will the United States do? Will it also use nuclear weapons? That raises the escalation, because the next thing would be a missile landing on U.S. soil.
Porque lo siguiente que va a ser un misil ya en territorio de Estados Unidos. ¿Y entonces qué?
So what then? It's normal. I think that if there's even a bit of common sense left in Washington, just a bit, not even much, they'll say, look, because of the Europeans' madness, because if they said, no, it's that the national security of the United States has been put at risk, you could understand that they also have their own plans. Their general staff has made plans for different scenarios. But why do the Europeans want this? Because they're looking for a way out of their pathetic internal situation. Come on, I think this option... No, of course not. They just let it happen, and we'll pick up the pieces later. We'll pick up the pieces later.
Ya recogeremos los restos. Se le intentaría poner un límite a Rusia en el sentido, oye...
They would try to set a limit for Russia, like, hey, don't cross this line. Of course. I mean, please, don't cross this line. Don't cross the Elbe. The Elbe. But that's it. I mean, there's no other option because the next step would be an open, full-scale nuclear war. I think that scenario is the last of the last and one that no general staff wants to reach because there's no possible victory. And since there's no possible victory, no one makes plans for a military campaign that can't be won. It's absurd. I mean, no one makes plans for a military campaign that can't be won.
Es decir, nadie hace planes por una campaña militar que no se puede ganar. Entonces, no. Y además, ¿qué ganaría Estados Unidos? Tú imagínate.
And besides, what would the United States gain? Just imagine, either complete self-destruction along with the rest of who knows what would become of human civilization, or what would it gain? What would it gain? What would it gain? Whatever is left of Ukraine, if the Russians advance to the Dnipro and beyond, would likely be a practically unviable state that would have to keep being financed because it couldn't sustain itself. Of course, the ambitions of some countries might lead them to say, hey, look, sure, these are Russian territories, but these here are Polish, Hungarian, or Romanian territories.
Húngaros o rumanos. Vamos a ver. Es decir, es que ha iniciado una...
Let's see. I mean, it has set off an absolutely insane dynamic. Absolutely insane. It's true that the problem, and this becomes clear when applying game theory, can be seen. There's a well-known Chinese professor, Shui-King Yang, who has done some work on this. And when you look at the structural forces at play, the interests of different actors, and apply game theory, of course, what do you see? He says, what I see is that a chain reaction could occur leading to a larger global conflict, to a third world war. Driven by what?
¿Impulsado por qué? Por el declive económico norteamericano.
Because of the North American economic decline, the rise of the multipolar order, something we've talked about many times, and the inability of Western elites to manage it, because these are elites suffering from a tremendous mental delusion. So, well, yes, that could happen. Of course, a scenario like that could happen. But let's suppose that in the end there are rational actors who say, no, let's see, this is as far as we go. Maybe it's not Macron, but maybe Macron won't last that long. Maybe it's not Merz, but let's see if Merz makes it to 2026. Starmer, maybe Starmer only has a few newscasts left. Who's going to replace them? Are they going to be people who keep going along with this delusion? Or maybe they'll decide to follow Trump's path and say, no, let's see, what really matters here is trade, commercial relations, managing what's already inevitable, the global historical process toward multipolarity. Or are we going to face it head on, fall into the Thucydides trap, and end up in a world war? So I always tend to think that in the end, there are irrational actions. In that sense, I think these are scenarios that could happen, but there's still room. And we'll see it depending on the signals we get on what happens in the coming months.
Yes, here are some not so promising signs. This, by the way, courtesy of our sister channel on Telegram, Wars and Geopolitics. There was a celebration in Lviv just a few days ago in Ukraine of the birthday of Stepan Bandera, a Ukrainian national hero, responsible for the Holocaust in Ukraine and Poland, openly and officially honored by the current Ukrainian state.
Well, the European Union already knows what kind of Ukrainian state will remain, and on top of that, they intend to integrate it into the European Union. Well, the Europeans will know. Go on, keep voting for those who are in power. Keep voting, ladies and gentlemen.
Sigan votando, señores.
Querido Juan Antonio, como siempre, un placer.
Dear Juan Antonio, as always, a pleasure. An hour and a half of conversation, longer than expected. Let's wrap it up here. Let's remember that from now on, Juan Antonio will be doing his show on Mondays. Not this Monday, because of the Three Kings celebration, but the following one, Monday the 12th. From now on, Demolishing Myths will have programming every day of the week, without interruption. Mondays with Juan Antonio, Tuesdays with Fernando, and the rest of the week, well, talks the usual until whoever comes next. Dear Juan Antonio, as always, a hug. Demolishers, thank you very much for joining us. Remember to follow us on our social media, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and remember to support us through our PayPal account.
Instagram. Recuerden ayudarnos a través de nuestra cuenta de PayPal, ahora también con contenidos exclusivos en Patreon.
Now also with exclusive content on Patreon. The link is below this video in the description, and there you can find a preview of our first video. It's already up as a teaser on the channel, and next week, if I remember correctly, on Tuesday or Wednesday, we'll be releasing the second exclusive video for Patreon, featuring a spectacular discussion about the end of Zionism with Jeffrey Sachs, Pascal Lothar, and a Canadian professor. Also amazing. Very, very interesting. We'll talk about all that next week. So every week we'll be creating at least one, if not more, exclusive pieces of content there, because we can't present that directly here, right? Demolishers, a big hug, and see you next time, Juan Antonio. Bye-bye. See you next time. Goodbye.
Hasta la próxima. Juan Antonio, chau, chau.
Hasta la próxima. Adiós.